Hey everyone, welcome back to Crouch Couch. Today I want to dive into some of the PvE and rating changes that are coming with Wrath of the Lich King, and will be here as soon as pre-patch drops, which could be as soon as next Tuesday, August 9th. Now, some of these changes you may already know, such as the majority of raid buffs being raid-wide instead of party-wide, but other changes may be news to you, such as the change to potion cooldowns, mana regen no longer ticking, which removes the ability to drink walk, the removal of a hard AoE cap, and other changes to just mob debuffs, raid comp, consumables, and more. And I hope this is helpful, and the changes are timestamped in the description for your convenience. So with that, let's get started. But first, if you like the content, please like and subscribe, and drop me a follow at twitch.tv/Kateria. That really helps me out. And hit up my Discord for additional questions and also additional resources. Now first, a real general change. So with Wrath of the Lich King, critical strike rating, haste rating, and hit rating all now affect both your physical and your spells. Thus, there's no longer spell hit and melee hit on gear, or spell crit versus melee hit. It's now just crit, or just haste, or just hit for your gear stats. Also, there is no longer healing power on gear versus spell damage on gear. It is now just one stat called Spellpower, and it affects both your damaging spells and your spell healing by set coefficients on your spells. So with this also means items with spell healing are now converted to spell power, and in general, the following formula is used for the conversion. So the 0.2x healing done plus the damage done equals your new spell power. So for example, the Golden Staff of the Cinder Eye, which drops off KJ, currently increases healing done by 550 and damage done by 183, and thus with the new formula, you take the 550, multiply it by 0.2, which is 110, add the existing damage done increase of 183, and you get 293, which is pretty damn good and is actually BIS equivalent or better for some classes such as mages. And this will happen to all gear with healing power come pre-patch, so keep this in mind when looking at healing gear right now, as it will soon change, and something which was only useful for healers before could now benefit you substantially as a caster. And while we're talking about casters, I quick want to touch on spell hit changing in Wrath, such that the spell hit cap for boss mobs is now 17%, because if you're at 17%, you no longer have to worry about that dreaded, unavoidable 1% miss chance on boss mobs. So this is great news, because it felt terrible getting RNG'd like that during cooldowns when there's nothing you could do about it. But also note that the beta is currently bugged and still has a 1% chance to miss on boss mobs no matter how high your spell hit is. But this is a bug that is known as the chance to miss is removed with Wrath. Most all buffs which used to be party-wide are now raid-wide. For example, your Spell Crit aura from Boomkin is now raid-wide. Wrath of Air Totem now gives 5% spell haste and is raid-wide. True Shot aura, mana replenishment from a Shadow Priest, Heroism and Bloodlust, all now raid-wide. And a side note, they also now, for Heroism and Bloodlust, they also now give a 10-minute exhaustion debuff, which prevents you from benefiting from Heroism and Bloodlust. But side note to that, this debuff is removed if you die, but basically no longer stacking of Heroism and Bloodlust. But you get the point. Buffs are essentially raid-wide now, and buffs being only party-wide is the exception. And really there's only one buff that's still party-wide, and that's the Draenei Racial Heroic Presence, which still only affects party members, so ideally you want 5 Draenei for your raid. But the good news is that it now gives hit for both spells and attacks, so you just need the 5, one in each of the parties. Some other things that are still only party-wide that aren't necessarily buffs but are worth mentioning, because they're sometimes thought of as buffs, are things such as any of the pulsing totems from your shaman are still only party-wide, so such as Mana Tide, Cleansing, Tremor, Healing Stream. And then another thing worth mentioning is Vampiric Embrace from Shadow Priest is still only affecting party members, and Vampiric Touch, while is no longer party-wide and is raid-wide, it only affects 10 members of the raid, and this is the case for all mana replenishment buffs that multiple classes can now provide, which I'll get into later next. But they only provide the buff for up to 10 members, and despite how the tooltip reads, if you bring 2 mana replenishment buffs to the raid, then you can provide the buff for up to 20 members. So it's recommended you bring 2 sources of mana replenishment unless you're running a very physical heavy raid. Following the change to raid-wide buffs, I also want to briefly touch on the significant revamp to just how many classes can provide different raid buffs and debuffs now, and just how many buffs and debuffs there are now. And the tool I'm using to go over this is wrathraidcomp.com, and I highly suggest going there yourself and hovering over each of the buffs to see just how they've all changed from TBC to Wrath, and just how many different classes can now provide some of them. This tool will definitely be helpful when putting a 10-man or 25-man pug together, or even your guild runs if certain people post absent for the raid and you need to know what you're missing. a few things I do want to note here is that first, the different buffs within each listing don't stack. So for example, you don't have multiple 3% damage buffs. You either get 3% from your Ret Pally, 3% from your Beastmaster Hunter, or 3% from the Arcane Mage. If you have multiple classes providing the buff, well then it's just redundancy in case one of them dies during an encounter. That said, not all of these buffs are created equal. For example, for Spellpower, Totem of Wrath is 280, but Demonic Pact scales off of the Warlock's damage, and thus with snapshotting, Demonic Pact can be better than Totem of Wrath even in Phase 1, and will continue to scale as the expansion progresses. For 5% Spell Haste, only a Wrath of Air Totem can provide this. For the 3% crit debuff, Totem of Wrath is superior to Heart of the Crusader and Master Poisoner for trash because the Shaman can simply drop the totem and all mobs within 40 yards will then have the debuff. While the other two methods require time to be applied, and with how fast trash dies in Nax, the totem is the only way to reliably and consistently apply the debuff, and it can be done immediately for all mobs. For Heroism and Bloodlust, while they do put a 10-minute debuff on the raid, their cooldown is only 5 minutes, so it's useful to have more than one Shaman so that if you wipe right after using Heroism, you don't have to wait 10 minutes before you can use it again, since your second or third Shaman would have it off CD since dying removes the exhaustion debuff. And on that note of dying, it also allows you to get a second Heroism in during combat for raid members that died during the encounter and were battle rezzed or had a soul stone. And lastly, I want to touch on our beloved and also hated buff, Innervate, which now regenerates a set amount of mana equal to 225% of the Casting Druid's base mana pool, which means it will always give you just under 8k mana, and it's now also a 3-minute CD, so definite nerf, but mana issues are also not as significant in Wrath. Again, not going to go through every buff here, so highly recommend taking a few minutes and going to wrathraidcomp.com and learning about the different buffs and debuffs yourself. The cooldown for potions has now been reduced to 1 minute, however, you can only use 1 potion per combat session, and once you are in combat and use a potion, the cooldown does not start ticking down until you drop combat. Thus, the trick is to pre-pot a haste potion or wild magic potion 1 second before the boss is pulled through, say, a pull timer, so that you can get 2 potion uses in combat as opposed to only 1. Just note that your second potion usage will have to be 60 seconds into the fight due to the 1 minute cooldown, but as it's your only pot, ensure you line it up with a second use of cooldowns or execute phase. And with this change, it's worthwhile when chain pulling to very briefly drop combat every now and then to allow potion cooldowns to reset so that mana users can mana pot and everyone can use another DPS pot as well. The mana regen formula is still derived from Int and Spirit as it is in TBC, it's just that these stats have less of an effect than they currently do. But the main change to mention here is that mana no longer regenerates by ticks and is instead constantly regenerating. And the main reason this is significant is that we can no longer drink walk. So if you're someone who's used to drink walking in vanilla and TBC, which really should be every mana user, then you will definitely notice this effect when playing Wrath of the Lich King. On the plus side, we no longer have to come to raid with 300 plus water, so at least there's that. AoE damage is no longer hard capped to a certain amount by spell, and instead the maximum damage is capped to what the damage would be when dealt to 10 mobs. Thus, your damage cap is now derived from how much it would deal to 10 mobs, but you aren't hard capped, so from now on, additional attack power and spell power will always increase your AoE damage. It's just that it's capped as to what that spell would deal to 10 mobs, and beyond 10 targets, the damage you would deal to 10 mobs is calculated and then divided among however many targets you're hitting. Thus, taking an example from the wiki, if a spell does 1000 damage per target, then against 5 targets you would deal 5k total damage with each target taking 1k damage. But against 10 targets, 10k total damage with each target still taking 1k damage. But if you then use this spell against, say, 20 targets, each target would only be hit for 500 as your total damage is capped at the 10k you would deal against 10 targets. So I hope this makes sense, but the main takeaway is that your damage cap continues to scale with gear, albeit with a 10 target cap. Raid consumes are much easier in Wrath, where you really should only need a flask and some food. And ideally, you won't even need your own food, as one person can set out a fish feast and provide the entire raid with their food buff, except for those who maybe want a different kind of food buff. This is because in Wrath, you'll no longer be using scrolls, oils or weapon attachments, kriegs, drums, or JC necks. Scrolls no longer stack, so you don't have to worry about using scrolls, and that should be the case come pre-patch here. However, while we're in pre-patch and you haven't yet leveled to 80, we'll still be using weapon oils and attachments, as well as drums of battle and jewel crafting next. But once Wrath launches and you reach level 80 and you replace your weapon, You will no longer be able to use weapon oils or weight stones, as they won't be usable on items with an item level higher than 165, which is essentially your heroic weapon drops and other previous weapons. And for drum buffs, such as drums of battle, they won't work on characters level 80 or higher, and there are no new drums to craft, as Blizzard decided to move away from drums in Wrath. And similarly, there's no new jewel crafting necks that provide party buffs, so using the old one is mostly no longer worth. Although healers may still be roped into using them in speedrun type scenarios, for everyone else, you just don't have to worry about it. Note that currently on the beta, you can still use oils on weapons, but this is a bug that will be fixed. And also for my fellow casters, note that we'll no longer be using Kriegs come pre-patch, as it will now count as a food buff, so we no longer have that buff. But on the plus side, we no longer have to do restock runs to Dire Maul North. Also, side note on the flasks, they changed to 1 hour duration come pre-patch, but when you craft the TBC flasks, you'll now get 2 flasks instead of 1. So if you were about to craft a bunch of flasks, hold off until pre-patch to save yourself some money. And for my mage bros, note that we'll be using flasks come pre-patch, so heads up to dump any excess elixirs you have, any stockpiles, and grab a few marks of the Illidari for your raid flasks. And also one more tip for the mages, flame caps no longer share a cooldown with mana gems, so once we go fire, we'll be popping those left and right. Now, I know some of you may be unhappy with these changes and view it as simplifying the game and making it more casual, but I urge you to definitely give Wrath a try. Phase 1 won't be a challenge since Snags is easy, but Ulduar is one of the best raids ever made, and the hard modes will definitely be a challenge, as well as min-maxing your character in those more complex encounters. So if you're unhappy with these changes, don't let them deter you for what it is sure to be an amazing expansion. With that, please let me know in the comments if I missed any significant PvE or raid changes coming with Wrath of the Lich King, and also let me know your thoughts on these changes. And as always, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and drop me a follow and tune into my live streams at twitch.tv/Kateria. And if you have additional questions or want additional resources, join my Discord. The invite link is in the description. Cheers, and see you all again soon.